Hello.
Welcome. Thank you for coming. I guess we can take a seat or something like that. We can also stand up. I don't really have a preference. Welcome here today, Your Techcellency, if I'm allowed to call you that. I mean, I've been in talks with you for a little while. I am super, super excited about you coming today and talking to us and telling us about what you do. But before we begin, since I've been at Google for a very long time, but I also know people that work in the embassies and in diplomacy, and that's a lot of different approach to things. Can you please just tell me about your first meeting with Google in this capacity as an ambassador?
Yeah, no, well, first of all, thanks for hosting me today, and thanks also for listening in. Yeah, I'm a career diplomat, so normally this is the kind of gear that you wear, and we're here because of the UN General Assembly, so suits and actually ties is sort of part of the uniform today. But when I arrived in Silicon Valley 12 months ago, one of the first meetings we had was actually in Mountain View with the Google headquarters, and it was a clash of two different cultures and to some extent a clash of civilizations, because together with my deputy, we went there in more or less dressed like this. And our counterpart came out in flip-flops and short shorts and I think an old Metallica T-shirt. And we actually have a fantastic picture where we're standing next to each other. And for me, this was sort of the wake-up call that we actually need a dialogue between different worlds. And after that, we also went out to buy a lot of jeans and a lot of white sneakers. So now the uniform is different, and we are also in that area a little bit different than what diplomats are normally like.
Yeah, I did hear about you saying that you'd made really poor financial decisions.
Yeah, I have too many suits, basically, now. Yeah.
So you're the world's first tech ambassador appointed by a country. Can you explain to the audience a little bit more about what a tech ambassador does and the whole idea behind it?
Yeah, sure. Well, if we go back a year or so, and perhaps 1.5 years ago, there was an innovation process inside the Danish government and inside the foreign ministry, where we looked a little bit on trends and how to bring basically the foreign ministry into the 21st century. And some very talented younger colleagues came up with a number of different ideas, and one of them was to appoint a tech ambassador. And the reason for this are two trends, if we look at it. One being that we think technology, and probably I don't have to convince anybody in this room or anybody watching in, that technology is going to be one of the main drivers for global development. It's going to have a lot of positive effects, but it might also have a couple of challenges along the way. In other words, technology will be defining the winners and losers of tomorrow, but it will also define sort of the foreign policy or international relations of this world. Also balance of power, where I think things like machine learning, artificial intelligence, perhaps even IoT, is going to be as important as conventional weapons or even nuclear weapons. So the mindset of looking at technology from a foreign policy point of view goes to the core of this initiative. And the other trend, or the other main reason why we did this was, of course, and this one I know I don't have to convince anybody about sitting here today, is that some of the big technology companies, not least in the US, are becoming very, very big, very influential, not least with the platforms that you guys develop and build and utilize. But we also see increasingly that companies are perhaps using that platform power also to begin influencing policies and the direction of this world. So we basically, or the Danish government basically, decided that instead of just watching the future pass by outside the windows, we wanted to actually begin treating the industry and technology and digitalization as a foreign policy priority, and by creating this first ever tech representation and begin dealing with these issues to seek to influence the direction, despite being a very small country.
And what would a company like Google have to gain by engaging a meeting with a tech ambassador?
I think you have a few more users than the size of the Danish population. But I think the basic idea behind this is actually that we can't do it alone. I think governments are always trailing behind on new technologies. We don't necessarily get it right on regulations or on legislation. Our policies are being challenged because of the fast pace of these new technologies. And whether you call it the digital age or the fourth industrial revolution doesn't really matter, because I think the gap is widening on our ability as governments or as international organizations to actually sort of cope with the future. But I don't think that companies are able to do it alone either. And of course, we might discuss a couple of examples over the last couple of months or the last year or so. But I think the point here is that we need each other, and we need to work closer together than we have perhaps in the past. And we need to find joint solutions on some of the big issues, both global issues, but also national issues. So this is basically a very big, warm, fuzzy hug from the Danish government to the tech industry, but also a sort of subtle way of saying we need to come closer together, and we need to define together solutions to some of the big issues that we are faced with, also on a global level.
Yeah, and as we talked about, there's one part where we're always saying, oh, governments are trailing behind, and digitalization for governments and all that, but tech companies as well needs to also be really at a level of how governments are thinking about protecting their inhabitants, and not only protecting, but also offering them opportunities and not letting them get caught behind in this like global tech revolution that we're seeing. Let's just call it the fourth industrial revolution. I think that's a nice term for it, because there's so many things that are happening out there. And just to dial it back a little bit, because we start out, we always talk about it like it's Denmark, and full disclosure, I am from Denmark. I've been living here for 8 years, but I still have a very big stake in thinking how interesting this is, So maybe you could explain to the world why Denmark, such a small little country on the northern tip of Europe with the population size of Colorado for Americans, why is it Denmark, of all countries that becomes the first to appoint a tech ambassador and gives them the mandate, to go out there and try and engage with us?
Well, I think there are three reasons why we came up with this. I mean, first of all, we had some, extremely talented younger colleagues who saw this and who came up with the idea and who were able to convince the senior management back home that we needed to go in this direction. The other reason is of course that we have a little bit of street cred on digitalization, because we are a very digital country. We are, whether you look at UN assessments or European Union assessments, we normally come out at the top of these assessments in terms of public digitalization. You probably know that 90% of all communications between the government and citizens in Denmark are today electronic. I think that's an all-time world record, which means that if my grandmother needs a new driver's license, she has to log on to a computer and go online to actually get that. So we have a tradition for being quite digital and also using this as a natural thing. If you look at something which every single Dane has, that's a civil registry system, something called the CPR system. It's basically a number, a personal identification number that is given to you within minutes after your birth, and it follows you throughout your life. And that contains a lot of the data that other countries are today discussing, whether you need sort of a whole of government approach or a universal identification system where you can store medical records or educational records and so on and so forth. And that's an integral part of the Danish society. And I think it's also one of the reasons why we have a high degree of trust in public government. That's perhaps actually one of the differences between Denmark and the US. We tend to trust the government quite a lot. I think at least in the part of the world or part of the US where I'm living in Silicon Valley, there seems to be a little larger trust in the private sector and in companies. But the way we use that trust in government is that we have this system. It hasn't been breached or hacked yet, and hopefully it will never do that. But it actually offers a lot of opportunities for using this data which is available. So I think those 2-3 things are one of the reasons why we came up with the idea. But the last one being that we've always been a small country, an open country, very dependent on others, also because of our size. So looking into how we prepare ourselves for the future, what will it mean for our labor market? What will it mean for global affairs? How can we continue to take a responsible approach to helping other parts of the world that are perhaps doing less well than we are ourselves? That's the last reason why I think we took this initiative.
And in that vein, and our history of using big data as a way of the population trusting the governments with our data. And it is quite wild to think about that the government actually has access to all your health information and all your income and tax information and all these things. Do you feel that that's a driving force, that the population of Denmark says, all right, we trust the government to forge these relationships with tech companies, and this is why it's not the US or China or France that's gone out and done this initiative?
I think, by the way, we might come back to that. Other countries are looking at what we're doing with quite a lot of interest, and I think a lot of other countries are considering whether to appoint tech ambassadors, whether it'll be in Silicon Valley or in Beijing or in Guangzhou or somewhere else. I think that's not the important bit. But the fact that other countries are getting inspiration for what we're doing in acknowledging that we need to treat technology and digital platforms in a more systematic way is positive. To some extent, it's part of my KPI that we deliver other countries, also because it's super lonely to sit out in Palo Alto all by yourself. And I really miss the National Day receptions, which is such an important part of diplomacy these days. I don't actually, but nobody is watching, right? So I can be completely honest there.
They will eventually. Yeah. It's going into the blog.
But I think the trust thing is important. But I also, be very honest, sitting here in front of techies who understand this much better than I do, we have a high degree of confidence between the citizens of Denmark and the public sector. When you look at sort of perception data on globalization or where the world is heading, the Danes are generally also quite optimistic. They look at the future in a positive light, even despite of global affairs and issues that you might point to currently. But I think it's also fair to say it doesn't take too much or too many Facebook, Cambridge Analytica cases to perhaps tilt that confidence. And we spoke a little bit about the CPR, civil registry system, before. And of course, one of the reasons people trust this is because it hasn't been breached, it hasn't been hacked. But one could imagine, of course, that the public trust in these systems and could go sour if we see more of these big scandals. So that's another reason why we need a conversation with technology companies, and that's one of the reasons why we have a lot of focus right now on data ethics, also on cybersecurity issues, so we make sure we protect these systems against malign actors, basically.
And I would also say, as a comment, working at Google, and I've been here for these last 9, almost 10 years, it's what's happened over the last year, has sort of for the first time, from a personal perspective, I work on these platforms, is that we're all of a sudden on the wrong side of the trust conversation, right? That's kind of new for us. It's always the governments that the public mistrusts. It's usually the tech companies have been good beacons and stewards of all this data and all these things, which we still are. But it's just the fact is that many of the things that we offer and have has far-reaching implications that we might not have been able to predict. But I can say that the discourse internally in the company is very much what you're saying there. Like, we need to make sure that we get around this.
That's good to hear.
Yeah. I guess that's also why you're here today. It's not tech diplomacy, we're just going to shut the door. It is a thing that's on everybody's mind, and we can also see that a lot of audience here that's a good point, right? But let's. I started out saying, ask questions, because technology can really cover everything. There's not a lot of things that's not influenced by technology. Your water is data-driven, it's everything that is put into it that's tech-driven, water, whatever. But I would say that a fair question could be, what have been at the core of your work the last 12 months that you've been a tech ambassador?
Yeah. Well, one of the differences between the job I have now and some of the jobs I've been doing previously is I get one question all the time. What on earth are you doing? And what is the success criteria for actually doing that? And I can tell you, I came directly from Jakarta in Indonesia. Nobody ever asked me the question, what do you actually do? And what's the added value of having an embassy in Indonesia or having an ambassador in Indonesia? I get that question all the time. And my answer is not very sexy, but I'll give it to you nonetheless. What we're trying to do is basically elevate our dialogue with the tech industry, with the companies, but also with other countries and international organizations. I mean, it's not a coincidence we're meeting today during the UN General Assembly Week, because technology and digitalization is going to be an important topic on development, on the future of multilateral systems. But the core of what we are trying to do and what my team is trying to do is to offer to Danish authorities a formalized platform for having a dialogue with companies like Google or some of the others, Alibaba, Tencent, on a wide range of topics. And what does that mean? It means that we're doing exactly the same as other embassies all over the world, not only Danish embassies, but US embassies or Belgian embassies, and that is to represent Danish authorities on whatever topic might be relevant. So in other words, one day it might be coming to Mountain View and say, we'd like a conversation about data privacy. The next day it might be a question of digital taxation, because that's a topic that is very much on the agenda in Europe these days. A third day it might be, how could we get access or convince Google to do investments in data centers in Denmark? And the third day it might be on some difficult questions on how do we avoid platforms being misused for radicalization, extremism, or terrorism. So that wide range of topics goes to the core of what we're trying to do. I think it's important to say that this is not a pessimistic tech agenda, and I'm not saying this to be friendly to techies in this room, but this is really about using and reaping all the opportunities that technology brings about. And we fundamentally think that technology will do good for this world, but we also have a realistic view on it, where we think we have to work together with Google, with others, to make sure that we mitigate those areas where there are real dangers and real difficulties. For example, on creating sort of global inequality or a digital poor part of this world, which I personally think is going to be one of the major challenges, getting the remaining 3.5 billion people online so they can also reap the benefits of these issues. But at the core of what we're trying to do is really this government to industry conversation. And in that sense, what I do is very old school. In fact, I would argue that it's sort of bringing diplomacy back to its roots. Diplomacy has always been about putting people into hotspots where changes were underway. In the old days, it was typically into war-prone areas or where conflict existed. Today, it's about putting diplomats into the heart of Silicon Valley so that we can have conversations with you guys on how we fix the world, or we make sure that we don't undermine some of the key values and institutions that we've been working on for a very long time.
Yeah, and I think...
so small, easy issues.
Yeah, small, easy issues, but we gotta also have to cope with the fact that there's something called legislation that you guys represent, and we must, looking at legislation, which is a tool you guys have, is a tool that the governments have, the US, everybody has, you can say legislation and technology definitely does not always move at the same speed. And obviously we can talk about GDPR as an example. Many people in here has been involved with that. And while it has been in the works for several years, when we look at how long it takes from the legislation example to actually be put into practice, we can also see that in California, they can push the Consumer Privacy Act through in, I guess, 2 months. That was real fast that they do these things. That's a part of it that's very, very interesting to how legislation and the political agendas and all that is not always fine-tuned to cope with our emergent technology. And if we look at what's coming up with blockchain and AI, when we look at decision-making and governance, what do you feel that you and I and everybody else here can do to close the gap between technology and regulation? And we can start saying, what can governments do?
Yeah, well, a couple of different angles on that question. It's, of course, the million-dollar question, how do we fix these issues? Well, I think from a government point of view, we have to recognize that we are going to be challenged over the next couple of years, over the next decade, because of the pace of new technologies. You mentioned blockchain. I think IoT is another good example. And of course, machine learning and artificial intelligence is probably going to transcend everything we do. I mean, no sector will be left untouched. No industry will be left untouched. And therefore, no government will be left untouched. I think from the industry side, and I don't want to be too rough on big tech, but what I would say is that I think we have a shared responsibility here. One of the things that I continue to argue quite a lot is that we might not see eye to eye between Europe and the US on some of these issues. There has been a bit of techlash in Europe, and I think on the US side, there has been perhaps some concerns about the direction that Europe is taking, GDPR being one of them. I think antitrust legislation is another one. But it doesn't change the fact that we have to stick together because we're still products of the same values that we paid a very high price to get to. And the conclusion of that is that we have to work also to find the right way forward. And just to take one example, if you allow me, Rasmus, digital taxation. I know it's a tricky issue. It's a tricky issue in Europe, and I know it's a tricky issue also with headquarters of tech industries. But if you look at Europe, technology companies pay around half of what traditional companies are paying in taxes. And you could say, well, that's a smarter way of operating. But for most European countries, this is an existential issue, because this is what basically undermines our ability to pay for education or healthcare, basically to uphold the welfare state. There are a couple of proposals from the European Commission currently being discussed. I don't think they're particularly popular in Mountain View, but you can correct me if I'm wrong on that one. But it doesn't really change what I think is the way forward, and that is that we have to work together on finding solutions also on, for example, on digital taxation. So what I mean by that is I think we need to enter sort of into a contract where we come to the industry also looking for advice, looking for some suggestions on what is the right way forward, not to stifle innovation, to make sure that we have a pro-tech, pro-platform environment in Europe. But we also expect from the tech industry and from the senior management teams that they help us to find the right way forward. It's not good enough to say we don't like the European Commission's proposal, and when you then ask the question, so what should we do instead? And the answer is, well, that's not up for us to define. I think it is, and I think that's where we are today, at a crossroad, where we have to expect from the senior management of the tech industry that they help us define the right way forward, whether it is on digital taxation or whether it's on regulation or whether it's on legislation. Because the absence of that is not going to help the industry, and it's certainly not going to help the governments or in our case, Europe either. So that's the way forward in my view. And that's what we're trying to do with this initiative, by the way.
No, I see it, and I could at some point say this, the communication is pretty much like one way, as you're saying. Like, we do get engaged and say we don't like that, but maybe we could build a feedback loop in that sense. But yeah, that takes time, and that's why you're the first tech ambassador to start getting these things going. You know, it's a legislation again, right? That's the tool that sits in one way, and maybe there's a gap in legislation in Europe that needs to be fixed and agreed upon by member states in the European Union.
No, absolutely. Can I just add one thing, Rasmus? I mean, yes, I think I don't think I'm revealing any state secrets by saying that, of course, Europe is not always united on how we deal with technology and digitalization, how we deal with the big technology companies. There are different views among EU 28 or EU 27 soon. But what we offer, and I think that goes a little bit back to one of your first questions, what's the value proposition that we bring also to a company like Google? Well, that is to have a dialogue also on the issues we might not see eye to eye on. It's also an opportunity to begin discussing, you know, how do we create the regulation of tomorrow so it doesn't undermine the commercial activities of the tech industry, which is perfectly fine for us. We don't have any problems with monopolies. We don't have any problems with companies growing and making money, as long as that is not misused, that dominant position is not being misused. So I think, you know, companies like Google or Facebook or Alibaba and others, they will find no better friends than Denmark, in the sense that we have always been light on regulation, but we've always been right on regulation. We have to make sure that we go in where it matters, also to protect our institutions and democracy and human rights, all the big stuff which is important and which we fought quite a long time for over several centuries. We have to make sure we don't undermine those institutions. And having that discussion and bringing the two parties together, I think is going to be essential in the next decade. And
I think from a personal perspective and all that, and I think speaking for many, that it is actually a point where we should get to. You know, technology moves at such an increasingly fast pace that even if you are in it, you're not necessarily always able to predict the influences it has all around. And this is the exponential change, right? It is faster and faster and faster, Moore's law and all these things, and the human brain thinks linearly. Yeah. And so does organizations. You don't necessarily get into that, but we'll try and get ahead of that. It would be the aspiration in that sense, and why you're here. But let's try and look at a little bit of a wider perspective, because your mandate is actually global, right?
Yeah.
Like we've been talking about the US and the European Union and all these like complicated, dense matters that are there. But let's talk a little bit about like where some exciting opportunities is out in tech diplomacy. So your team is kind of like you work from Silicon Valley. Sorry about that, but you also have a part of your team is situated in Copenhagen and in Beijing.
Yeah.
For you, what does it actually mean to be an ambassador to a global industry? It's not just...
It means having meetings at horrible times almost every day, because finding a common time to have the whole team present is basically impossible because of the time differences. This is also a foreign policy experiment. I think it's important to mention that. We haven't done it before. We don't think anybody else has done it before, but we think it's the right way to look at diplomacy in the 21st century, that it's not only about having one embassy to one country, but it's in fact looking at an industry or a sector in a holistic way. Again, I represent the foreign ministry, so it goes without saying that we are focusing on the global aspects of new technology. So I think if you look at the US or the Americas, if you look at Europe, and if you look at Asia, changes are underway. It goes without saying that there is a shift or a change also in balance of power. I think when you look into the crystal ball, it's evident that in Europe we say it will move east. I guess where we're sitting, it could also move west. But the point being that China and other Asian countries look as though they're going to be using technology as a game changer also for their position on the global scene. It's interesting if you look at investments in artificial intelligence last year, venture capital investments. I think 38% or so went to the US, 48% went to China, and the rest went to the rest of the world, which, by the way, includes the European Union. I think it doesn't require too much creativity to see that that's perhaps the contours of a new global order, and that we might see technology being a driver for significant change also in the global scene. I think where we're struggling in Europe is, of course, to have a better focus on innovation. We need to also build some of the unicorns that the US and China and the Asia is extremely good at doing. And I think that requires us to take a look on regulations, on legislation, but it also requires us to take a look on mindsets and perhaps a little bit on access to capital for some of these big companies. I think Europe has a role to play. I know we're sitting in New York, but I think Europe could play a role in the sense of help define the boundaries for new technology. I know that GDPR, the data protection regulation, is not necessarily popular everywhere. It's not popular everywhere in Europe either with small and medium-sized enterprises. But it's a first attempt to try and define the boundaries and to make it crystal clear that data is something which is also personal, something that you can own yourself and that you have the right to be forgotten further down the road. Is it perfect? Perhaps not. But it's an attempt to try and set some boundaries for new technologies between sort of the wild west of Silicon Valley, where everything goes and where it's all about building and creating, but also the wild east, where you see the utilization of new technologies happening in perhaps not an unregulated space, but certainly a space which is very different than what we are seeing in Europe right now. So again, from our point of view, from a foreign ministry point of view, this is also about looking at where the world is going to be, not only in 5 years, but also in 15 years or 25 years, because that matters, even though you are a very small country at the top of Europe.
No, yeah, now you're talking about, I guess, looking when we talk about the East and China and all that, you're looking into like the private sphere and what sort of invasion we can find there. But we are talking also a little bit about like influences foreign policy and all that, which we were talking about before. What kind of like similarities or differences do you see between trying to do that in the US and Europe and in Asia, trying to get in there and see if you can influence that?
On the foreign policy side?
Yes.
Yeah, it goes without saying that we've been spending quite a lot of time with US technology companies to begin with. Also, again, for transatlantic reasons, we think it's important to stick together. And what we've been trying to do is to use old diplomatic tools, which is going to the headquarters to have conversations, trying to convince in a gentle and nice way, the headquarters, to begin focusing more on some of these issues, also to take action in particular areas where we might have issues or challenges. That has worked well with some companies, perhaps a little less well with other companies. Some of it is also because of curiosity. What is this about? Is this TechPlomacy initiative, is this all about bringing the big stick of regulation and trying to do damage to the opportunities of big companies? Well, it's not. And once we've had the opportunity to explain what we're trying to do, most companies have said, well, we actually see that this makes sense and we would like to work with you on this agenda. But we need more people around the table. We need more countries. We need all the international organizations around the table. Which is, by the way, one of the reasons we're sitting in New York again during the UN week. We welcome the UN Secretary General's decision to set up a high-level panel on digital cooperation. So I think and the European Union has done something similar under the High Representative Mogherini. So I think this is a trend. We are seeing more countries, we are seeing international organizations beginning to step up to the plate and focusing on digital issues and on technology per se. So there are some differences, and of course there are differences also when you look towards China and some of the big companies they have there. My Prime Minister is going to meet Jack Ma later this week, so perhaps I can come back on Friday and give you feedback on how that discussion was compared to some of the other discussions we've had.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
No, actually, it is fascinating, and you're talking about the investments into AI that the US is making, that China is making, which we move into a faster decision-making world. Which is really, but I want, and this is my own little thing, I always feel that that's so interesting to look into. For you in 10 years, given everything that we're doing with AI and everything in 10 years, how do you think the Security Council will look like?
I think it'll look more or less as it does today. It's
you don't think Google will have a seat, huh?
We can do a sweepstake and perhaps see where it heads. I think it's important to say that although we are arguing for a closer public-private partnership on some of the big issues, there are still a domain which should remain for states and for nation states. And I think the UN will remain, and the Security Council will remain a fora where states are discussing some of the big issues. However, I think what we will see is a small revolution where all these discussions will also take place in the margins of the UN or in the margins of the European Union, where we begin having discussion groups or discussion forums to bring about the opportunity to sit together with the industry and actually talk about issues, including foreign policy issues, including how do we make sure that you guys will also take responsibility for bringing the next 3 billion people online. You will also take responsibility to make sure that we don't have, again, parts of this world that will fall behind. Because we shouldn't forget that this is not only about bringing healthcare or education to people that are less fortunate than others. This is also about making sure that the root causes of extremism or migration flows, that they will not be nurtured simply because of global inequality. So these are real issues. There might be commercial opportunities for a company like Google, but also from a government point of view, it is incredibly important that we work together to try and fix some of the inequalities that might exist on a global level. And
then you answered one of my next questions.
I'm sorry about that.
No, that's completely fine. That's where we should go, right? We should meet instead of the problems popping up. You should be verbalizing them, but it was talking about privacy and fake news and all that, and where we are there and how we can work together. But I do feel that that's the future of collaboration and the UN, and that if you can talk about what the last 60 years defined the Security Council and the end of World War II and where we're moving with the Cold War, whether that's relevant in the next 10 years, perhaps. But then as we move beyond that, it is bigger challenges that we will need to partner ourselves. You cannot have the hammer of communism or the power of capitalism to solve some of those things. Yeah. On my personal opinion. Anyways, I have 2 more questions left, and then I think I'm going to start opening it up to the floor for questions. I've been listening to your podcasts, and we also met last year, right when you became newly minted. The one thing you did say was that after the first year, your success criteria would really be that you weren't the first and only tech ambassador. How's it going out there?
Relatively well, but not exactly as good as I hoped. We are seeing a lot of other countries coming up with similar appointments. I don't think anybody else have been given exactly the same title, but I have a group of colleagues around the world that are dealing with some of the same topics. Some of them are called cyber ambassadors, some of them are called ambassadors for digitalization, others are called ambassadors for entrepreneurships and startups. But I think we will see a wave coming in not too distant future. And again, I think that would be absolutely fantastic. And I would actually think that this is in the interest of everybody, not only governments, but in fact also of the industry. It would also enable us to take collective meetings, so you don't have to open the doors every time an individual tech ambassador comes by, but that we can actually begin looking at how to cooperate together. And perhaps I can deliver sort of a small teaser. We're not ready with it yet, Please but one of the things that my team is working on is in fact to perhaps create sort of a coalition of like-minded countries and a couple of companies where we actually create a forum where we can discuss the broad range of topics in relation to technology and where technology is heading. So perhaps when we have a conversation next year, that will be established and we can talk a little bit about the vision and where we see that heading. I think that's about what I can say today. So stay tuned for more information on that. But it actually goes to the core of what we're trying to achieve with the TechPlomacy initiative.
No, but that's actually true. It makes it bigger companies easier to, because we are organizations, right? We're at fault at everything that happens. It's very top down to try and say, hey, there's something really interesting we need to engage on here. And sometimes it's hard to get that bubbled up. So the bigger you have, the bigger of a brand, an umbrella organization, saying we are engaging with that, because the UN even for us can be hard to engage with, or even state departments, which I've tried previously in my job, where we did work very close to the Danish state for various things. So that would be a very good thing. Again, I need to refer back to me listening to the podcast and all that. And it's, by the way, it's called TechPlomacy Talk. And it's an amazing podcast, and you should really, Casper has fantastic people he interviews.
I paid him to say that.
Yeah, get a little, it's on Podcast Addict. You can easily find it on SoundCloud and everything. No, it's great, and on iTunes, right?
Sorry, yes.
That's okay. It's an open platform.
We diversify.
No, it's an open platform, it's all good. But really, if you have any interest in this sort of thing, please get into that. And if anybody has any questions, please get to the microphones. But you always finish with the question of these talks saying hey, what question should I have asked you, but I didn't? And what's the answer to that question?
Yeah, it's the poor man's response when you know that you're not clever enough to come up with a good question. So it's a nice way to get people to come up with some interesting answers. I think the question you should have asked, Rasmus, and I sort of indicated a little bit the reply already, is what can you do for us? What can Google do to support an initiative like that? And I think what is important is that we experience and we see also publicly a renewed societal responsibility from the tech industry. I'm not only talking about Google here, but the industry per se. We need to see a societal responsibility which is proportional to the kind of influence you guys have when you look at the platforms and all the new technologies that you're rolling out. We haven't spoken too much about healthcare, but I know it's a massive investment also for a company like Google. I think there is a commercial dimension to this, and that is I think we all are desperate to see a lot more responsibility, a lot more engagement, also a lot more creativity in finding answers to some of these difficult questions. So I think what you can do for us, which should serve Google's own interest or the industry's own interest, is actually to open the doors and begin becoming more comfortable with having discussions with governments. We're not out there to get you. In fact, we are out there to work with you and help each other solve what I think are really timely and incredibly important questions, not least in this day and time and age. We're talking about democracies, we're talking about human rights issues, about gender equality, we're talking about inequality at the global scale. These are not small issues, these are incredibly important issues, regardless of whether you work for government on the dark side or whether you work for an upcoming tech industry company like Google.
I duly noted, and thank you very much.
So sign here if you...
Yes, I think I'll have somebody else do that. But no, I think everybody is always looking for making collaboration. Google has a mission, right? And that is making the world's information, how is it? Come on, help me here, free and universally accessible? Exactly, right? Which really ties into...
I guess you have a test when you move into Google and you have to be able to answer this one.
That's true, but yeah, that's our mission. Now I'm getting a little bit flustered in that sense, can't even recite the mission. But anyways, let's start with the questions for the time we have. And let's start with the right side microphone. Hi, you could state your name and then...
Hi, I'm Gabriella. I'm a designer here at Google. Thank you so much for talking to us today. So my question is, I'm from Mexico. Where the idea of the government knowing everything about you is bad. You don't want that. So I'm curious, how did you achieve this 90% of your interactions with citizens being digital? Is there a lot of infrastructure? Do people have computers at home? Do they all have internet? Do they have that kind of internet literacy? And the second one is, did you have to persuade them at all, or do they just trust you?
Yeah, a really good question, and thanks for posing it. We're not, let me put it this way, we of course acknowledge that it's much easier to implement systems like that when you have a small homogeneous country like Denmark, where the distances are relatively small, and where we already have a high degree of digitalization. But if I'm going to say it a little bit black and white, one of the reasons I think we have such a high degree of penetration of digital solutions is in fact because we didn't ask the population. This was something which was implemented gradually, initially primarily out of efficiency reasons. We wanted to, save resources, get more bang for the buck in our communications and our service delivery to people, and going digital was certainly part of that direction. I think that discussion has changed today, where it's much more about quality, not only about efficiency. But the honest answer is it was gradually introduced, and the interesting thing was that the public sector took the lead. This was not something that came from the private sector. The public sector took the lead. It was not incredibly popular, neither in the private sector to begin with, but people got used to it, and today it's actually a competitive advantage because Danish companies are used to this. They've been doing it for forever, but also the people are used to it. And actually one thing which might be shocking if you live in the US is on average it takes a Dane 15 minutes to do the tax report, the annual tax report. 15 minutes, because everything is provided digitally. You just go in and you check, the numbers. Do they look okay? Most people go to the end and see, are we getting money back, or do we need to pay some money? But that's some of the advantages, and people enjoy that. So I think the popularity is certainly there. And so the second question was? Oh,
did you have to? I guess you kind of already answered it. Did you have to actually persuade them to get on board? But I think you said that you kind of implemented it gradually.
Yeah, we did. But of course, as I said, what I think we had to pay attention to was to make sure everybody was on board. So there is an analog way of replying to government questions or to interact with the government, because of course not everybody is online. And I think that's the important bit, that you have sort of a safety net around those that are not online. But the direction is crystal clear. We want to have everybody on board, and I think with the next generations coming on board, that will be even more natural than it is today. But again, it is easier in a country like Denmark than it might be in a big country like Mexico.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, Your Excellency. My name is Klaus. Welcome to Google. I'm an analyst here. I'm also a fellow Dane, and I'm going to preface my first question with saying I used to work at your organization. I've since switched your nice dress shoes with these very comfortable sneakers.
Good for you, and condolences about your experience before.
Oh, thank you. So my first question is on foreign relations in general. So Google is pretty good at making decisions based on data and informing our product development. How do you see that informing foreign relations, for example, in your own organization? Are we taking in more data to make informed decisions? And the second question is more on the monopolistic nature of a lot of these companies in the network economy and regulation of the same. So a lot of the innovation that Google is doing is often when we go to the marketplace and say, actually we can do better. So take, for example, Google Chrome. There might be several reasons for that, or Google Fiber, where Google decides to go out and challenge some of the incumbents of the market. How do you avoid regulating some of that innovation that also comes from big companies? And when you do that, once you start to meddle in the market, how do you avoid that, for example, saying, well, we're going to regulate maybe some of the American companies and the European companies, but maybe the Alibabas and Tencents of the world will then go in and get a bigger share of the market?
Yeah, super good questions. On the first one, how do we use data in foreign policy? Well, I think we don't use it enough. And part of my mandate together with my team is also to help sort of change the mindset inside the government or inside the foreign ministry in a more digital direction. What does that mean in practice? It means, for example, that when we look at our development cooperation with Africa or with Asia, we're also taking now a firm view on whether we're doing the right stuff. You know, is it good to focus on delivery of water in Tanzania or in Kenya, or should we in fact look at infrastructure and building the right competences for people so they can, again, reap the benefits of the digital age? That's one area to look at it. The other area is, of course, to see whether we, as a delivery mechanism, can use data in a better way inside the foreign ministry. And last year I'm sorry, I have to name a rival company, but it's a US rival company. We supported a collaboration between the Danish Refugee Council and IBM. And that partnership was about using data on migration flows. First of all, to better predict, you know, in Europe, where people are coming from, what are the reasons why people are migrating, but it was also to help deliver better humanitarian efforts. So in other words, people in extremely difficult conditions and dire needs, how do we get the right kind of assistance to them so we don't send out the wrong stuff that they don't need? And I think data is going to be creating a small revolution in how we deliver those kind of services. So we get more bang for the buck, so efficiency again, but actually also make a bigger difference for the people on the receiving end. So I think data will play an incredibly important role. But as with any other organization, it takes a little while to get the mindset going in that direction, but that's part of what we're trying to help with. On the other issue, you know, I think you point to one thing which we're still struggling with in Europe, and that is how do we support innovation? How do we make sure that we don't regulate technologies in a way that actually will be shooting ourselves in the foot in the long term? There is a lot of focus on antitrust and competition, and I'll be honest with you to share that, you know, when I moved to the US last year, and when I went to the headquarters in Silicon Valley, one of the first questions was always, "You're Danish?" I said, "Yeah." "Isn't the EU Commissioner for Competition, isn't she Danish as well?" I said, "Yeah." And they said, "You know, how does that work together? Because you just said this is a tech-positive environment." But I think and I told Commissioner Vestager myself, so I can tell this honestly.
Thanks.
The interesting thing is, just in the 12 months we've been on the ground, I think there has been a convergence of view across the Atlantic on some of these issues, where there is a recognition that regulation is not only a bad thing, as long as we do it in the right areas and then leave the other areas alone. So I think if you look at Commissioner Vestager, she's gone from sort of being persona non grata in certain parts of Silicon Valley or the Bay Area to become a little bit of a rock star. And you know things are changing when the venture capitalists are saying, well, perhaps we need to take a look on regulation and we need to invest more in companies that have a bigger social corporate responsibility. Then things are changing, and I think that's a positive thing. And I think that will actually also build, you know, better companies and more commercially sustainable companies. But I think the jury is still out on how we get it right in Europe. We can't fix that as a small country, but I would argue, not to be too focused on my own country, that we punch above our weight on these issues simply because we have, you know, the degree of digitalization, and we have, you know, a positive approach to technology. So we can hopefully also help make sure that Europe moves in the right direction on some of these difficult questions. But again, we need the industry to help us define what the right direction is. So that's why we're inviting everybody for a long-term dance.
Thank you.
And we have a question over here.
Sure, appreciate it. Thank you for coming and speaking to us today. As a veteran myself of a similar organization, I worked at the U.S. government, U.S. e-government and IT office while it was getting started up. I have a great appreciation for the opportunity and the challenges you have in front of you. And you sort of answered this a little bit, but as you speak about the breadth of what you're doing and the purview of it, I'd imagine there are probably some legacy pieces of the Danish government that may not want you meddling in their business. And how have you been able to get the opportunity with them to create the influence you need to sort of enact these things back on home ground?
Yeah. That's evidently an insider's question, you know, how difficult it is to get bureaucracies to move in the right direction. Well, the interesting thing is, you know, I come from the foreign ministry, but I would actually argue that we work as much on the domestic agenda as we do on the foreign policy agenda. There are numerous activities back home which is about preparing Denmark for the fourth industrial revolution. And one of the things that we're doing is actually linking up with a lot of the ministries back home, or a lot of the authorities, whether it's the Ministry for Labor, or the Ministry for Transportation, or the Ministry for Healthcare. And the thing we're doing with them is both to be sort of a forward operating post in the epicenter of new technology. So basically being out there collecting information, doing small analysis, you know, telling colleagues back home, you better be aware that, you know, Google is looking at retina scanning for diabetes patients. You know, that will have, you know, an impact also on the way we treat patients back home. How do we prepare our healthcare systems for that kind of new technologies coming to a theater near us very soon? So being that sort of beacon out there, bringing information back home, I think plays an incredibly important part in both changing the mindset back home, but in fact also in a very practical way, help look at, you know, is our legislation prepared for those opportunities? Or are there areas where we want to work with Google or other companies to make sure that when you do healthcare or when you do education, that we you know, get it right, so it also fits together with our approach. I don't know whether you know this, but Uber was introduced in Denmark, and then it was banned, I think, more or less a year after its introduction for a number of different reasons. I'm not going to say that my office, had it been in existence 5 years ago, that it would have fixed everything. What I would argue, though, is that I think Uber is a pretty good example of a new technology or a new platform coming into Europe, coming into Denmark, where had we had a tech ambassador or my office a few years ago, we could have identified that and said, well, let's work with the Ministry of Transportation back home, or the appropriate authorities, and see what we can do. What are the fine lines? What are the red lines for Denmark? And then have a dialogue with the headquarters over here to make sure that it's not introduced in the wrong way. And I think that should be in the interest of the companies, but it's certainly also in the interest of a country our size.
Sure.
Did you notice how I avoided answering exactly how the bureaucracy is? Anyway, good.
Very positive answer to, I'm sure, other existing challenges, but thank you.
No, but to be honest with you, it's not always easy. But I think in any organization or any big industry, you know, there's always resistance when you try and do things in a new way. We've experienced that, but I think the goal is so important that we get this right, that you know, eventually it will cause a lot of changes, both in mindsets and also how we do business. And we've seen this just in the 12 months we've been underway.
I want to make sure we get through all our questions.
Sure.
I see people lining up, so over here.
Briefer.
Hi, my name's Jimmy. I'm a former Googler, and my question is, you know, anyone who's been paying attention to the news has seen there's like increasing evidence that Russia, for example, is using technology platforms, whether it's, you know, Twitter or Facebook, advertising platforms, to try to influence democracies. Do you see that these sort of geopolitical conflicts have a risk of increasingly spilling over into tech? And what would you know, what's your expectation, or the Danish, you know, Foreign Ministry's expectation for Google and other tech companies' role? You know, is it as a neutral arbiter, or would you expect them to take proactive measures in these sorts of conflicts?
Yeah, super good question.
So have you got that question?
Yeah, super good question, and it enables me to say that I think we've realized that cybersecurity issues is not something that will go away. In fact, it might increase over the next couple of years, also as we digitalize more and more parts of our societies. And of course we are, and you know, my government has said this repeatedly, we're extremely concerned about the way Russia is operating in the cybersecurity arena, and we need have better defensive mechanisms, but we also need international collaboration to try and sort of mitigate these issues. These are not small, destructive incidents. This is about potentially meddling with elections or undermining, public confidence in institutions, etc. So these are real issues that we take extremely seriously. We need an international collaboration also to make sure that those malign actors that are actually performing these things, that they are brought out in the open and in the right circumstances, that we have attribution in that case. But we also, and that's to answer the last part of your question, we certainly expect the industry to take a responsibility in this area. And we know it's incredibly complex, and there is a very fine line between meddling with freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and then of course removing content that you identify positively as being not truthful or basically based on profiles that doesn't exist. And I think that dilemma is going to be important to try and find the silver bullet for. It's not going to be easy, but we're going to put a lot of efforts into it, and we expect, and we are going to work very hard to make sure the industry also plays its part.
Thank you.
So we are at time. However, I would like to, if possible, and I get an okay from the control room back there, to get the last few questions through. So over here.
Hi, I'm Kira, and I actually just joined Google New York from Google Denmark. So I have lived and worked in Denmark for about a year and a half. And in the last 10 years, that was the 10th country in which I lived and worked. So what I see is that there's actually this growing population, of people who, they might not be just digital nomads, but obviously that's, part of the group as well, who are kind of, in different countries, and obviously they're experiencing the digitalization level in different countries differently. And what I notice is that actually no country that I've lived and worked in, they really think in any way about people like that who actually have their presence beyond the country. So I know that obviously Denmark has done a lot, and with like Estonia, with their like e-citizenships, they're looking at that as well. But I have kind of a twofold question. Like, could you share, is this part of a discussion where people are becoming more globalized and they're not really looking at any single one country as like the source of truth of their identity or of their digital identity? And number two, do you feel that you, in your position, can you actually do something about that, or are you having these discussions in your circles as well?
Enormously difficult question. What I would say is that I think you represent a group which is growing in numbers these years. I think if you look at it from a country point of view, what there is renewed focus on is that we need people like you with skills and competences to help drive the economy and build the new technology companies. And I can tell you very honestly that I haven't met a single Danish tech company who hasn't said, well, we're in desperate need for skills and competences that are very difficult to find, even in Europe or in Copenhagen or wherever it might be, Stockholm, Estonia, so on and so forth. So I think a lot of focus will go into that direction, both to make sure we educate a new generation that has the right skill sets to work in a digital world, but also to make sure that we can attract the kind of competences that we need for the companies. The problem is, of course, it's a global competition. When you sit in Silicon Valley, I don't think I've met any company who hasn't said, well, it's damn difficult to find the right engineers or the software engineers that we need. The competition is fierce, and I think that competition will become increasingly global, so we also need global solutions to those aspects. Whether I can do anything in that dimension, well, I think what we can do is to bring back information and knowledge that these are discussions that are taking place also among the next generation of tech-savvy people that we would like to attract to Denmark. We can't offer any good weather in Denmark, but the city's not too bad, and you can bike around everywhere. So there are pros and cons. So perhaps we need to be better at branding Denmark also, not because of the weather, but because of the quality of life as well.
And that's where he can pay me back money for being able to pitch Denmark as a tech capital. Yeah. All right. I know we're way over time, but last question from over here.
Hi, my name is Tim. I'm a software engineer here. My question is, traditionally when new technologies came into space, we generally didn't have an ambassador, right? We didn't have an ambassador to, say, Standard Oil.
Yeah.
traditionally, when you wanted to get access to technology or to skill set, you would usually work with, you know, the State Department or whatnot of whatever country, and through that you'd create, you know, economic, you know, deals or whatnot. And that's been the case, I guess, until now to some extent. So another way of asking the same question is, like, what's I understand the initiative of trying to, you know, outreach to the tech industry, but can you give me an idea of like what's the urgency coming from to some extent?
Yeah, really relevant question. And perhaps I can begin by give you an example of the kind of critique that we've been faced with in the first year. It's quite often that we are being asked, so are you now putting companies before countries? So in other words, is this, you know, elevating Google to a de facto state without having, you know, democracies below it and all of that? And my reply to that, or our reply to that, is always, well, this is in fact about trying to protect the role of states in future governance, because I think governance is going to come under a lot of threat or face a lot of challenges because of the kind of platforms that you guys are building and rolling out. It doesn't respect the national borders as perhaps some of the older industries would. But I think the real, you know, the pertinent part of your question is, why is it different now than it was, you know, 50 years ago when the oil industry began to roll out? And that, I think, is because of the pace. So I do think that, you know, I don't want to call it exponential, but I think what we're seeing is incredibly fast pace of the new platforms we rolled out. The way that that technology basically penetrates everything we do, all sectors. It doesn't matter whether you're in construction or whether you're in healthcare. Technology is going to be a game changer potentially within a very short time span. So I think that's the reason why we think time is ripe, and it is something different than oil. I think data is not a finite resource, so you will continue to sort of expand and build on that, and it gives enormous opportunities. And it might also challenge a country like Denmark or the European Union or the United Nations in a more profound way than what we've seen with some previous technologies. So that's at least our argumentation, that this is different, it feels different, and therefore we need a different reply or response to that. And that reply or response in our case is part of TechPlomacy and what TechPlomacy is here to do.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Billion thank you, everybody. If you could give a hand to Casper.